Energy Innovation Week. This webinar will be broadcasted live on YouTube, and you will be able to get a recording once the webinar is finished. I'd just like to direct your attention to the two chats we have. So you're welcome to use our regular chat to introduce yourselves and to discuss amongst yourselves, and then try to direct all of your questions to the Q&A chat so that your moderators, Miguel and Daniel, can later sort through the questions in the best way. I would like to now leave the floor to Prab to give you a bit of an introduction and welcome our moderators here today.
Hello, everyone. And on behalf of the Florence School of Regulation and especially FSR Global, I would like to welcome all of you, our moderators, as well as our speakers and our attendees to this very interesting first chat on digitalization and long-term investments in energy assets. A quick word about FSR Global. So we are the part of FSR, which takes FSR to and all the learnings of FSR to the global south and to emerging economies. We work with many countries across the world, from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Some of you might have already heard about us. This is for the ones who haven't. You can always go on our website and check out all the interesting things we have been doing. And the idea is to bring together and work on SDG 7 via 17. So today we are at the first section, like I said, digitalization and long-term investments in energy assets. And I would like to introduce our moderator. First is Daniel Schmiller. He was the former regulator of Peru and also the chair of the International Confederation of Energy Regulators. And we have Miguel Vasquez. Professor Vasquez is also a part-time professor at the European University Institute. So with that short introduction, I would like to hand over the session to Miguel. Please.
Hi. Well, welcome everybody to the Energy Innovation Week that organized Florence School of Regulation. As Pratt said, my name is Daniel Schmerler, and together with my colleague Miguel Vasquez, will be co-chairing the three sessions that make up this event. The panel of today is titled Digitalization and Long-Term Investments in Energy Assets. First of all, I am going to tell you what is the story we are going to talk about. The idea is to reflect on how to draw up long-term contracts, how to make those contracts digital. The goal is to facilitate the agreement among the counterparties and reduce transaction costs. And from there, identify whether digitalization helps to get better investments in the energy sector, and if this allows new agents to enter and the forming of new contractual relationships. To delve into this important topic, we have the participation of three panelists, all of them prominent professional women from the world of energy. They are Elena Osenik, Associate Program Officer of the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, Carolina Zelaya, former Legal Director of CNE, the Electric Regulatory Agency of Chile, and Hadley Taylor, Program Manager of Policy and Regulation of the International Organization Sustainable Energy for All, C4All. Welcome, Elena, Carolina, and Hadley, and thank you for participating in this session. Briefly, I tell you the dynamical way we will develop this session. There will be two blocks of questions to the panelists, and immediately afterwards, Miguel Vasquez will synthesize what was discussed by our three guests and wrap up the panel. Last but not least, as Jessica said, we will have some minutes for Q&A. To do this, we encourage our audience to write their question during this session using the chat, indicating their name, the city and country in which they are located, and if the question is addressed to one of the panelists or to all of them. Without further ado, let's start. The first question is for Elena. Elena, what's the role of digital short-term signals in system expansion? Please, Elena, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm happy to be here with you today. And I'm very excited to see that we have such a global panel and as well as a global audience. So let's start at the beginning. We're witnessing increased complexity and disruption in the energy sector. So all of this requires a combination of solutions. And actually the importance and the relevance of digitalization is highlighted by the advancement in decentralization, but also electrification. So these are two other innovation trends which we are observing happening around the world in the power sector. And when it comes to the distributed ledger technologies, these are working in tandem with other digital technologies like the Internet of Things and artificial intelligence. And together, these tools can help to improve the data collection, but also improve the decision-making process and eventually facilitate transactions. Now, we will discuss about all of this later today, but I think what is key here is that we see digitalization in the power sector as being defined as the conversion of data into value for this industry. And I think we can unpack a little bit some of these aspects as well in the Q&A part or perhaps later in discussion, because I mentioned the data generation, the decision-making, and as well the transactions. However, what I would like to send you now as a message is that we need to have a systemic view at digitalization, also for long-term investments. Why? That is because the enabling technologies, like the digital ones that we're discussing here today, create new opportunities for the system operators to operate the system. Now, in order for the system operator to benefit from these technologies, we would need to have the underlying market design and the necessary regulations in place so that the private sector can identify new business opportunities. Now, if this is the case, that's very good and relatively straightforward. However, if this is not the case, we would need to devise new regulations in order to incentivize the investments. And here the question is, how do we monetize the value created by these new technologies, by all this data that we have in the system thanks to these technologies? And this is actually where we can create new business cases by incentivizing investments. And this can help actually the private sector to create new revenue streams, which eventually will lead to investments in new enabling technologies. So as you see, I'm back to the first aspect of investments in enabling technologies. So we're creating a virtuous loop. Okay, but when we do this, we would also need to take into account the changing roles of the current actors and also the emerging ones. So we won't have to go into details, but we also see that the DSOs become more active, the distribution system operators become more active in the system, perhaps to even procure flexibility in local markets. We see consumers becoming prosumers, and the list can go on and on. Now, I would like to give an example, and I will leave it here for now. And that is that in a European system, which is a market-based system, which is interconnected at European level, the short-term digital signals can be harnessed by market participants in two ways. So I mentioned that in order to have a systemic approach, we need innovations in the various dimensions that I mentioned. So in terms of market design, if we increase the time and the space granularity, we can direct investments where they are most needed in the system, but also on the generation side. So on the one hand, in physical infrastructure, I'm thinking right now about transmission projects between bidding zones or between two countries with very high price differences. There is the place where we need to invest in the system. And now why is that? That is because in an area, let's say in a market area or in a country with very high solar radiation, if the prices are relatively low, there could be social welfare benefits by trading with the neighbors. So here is where we need to expand the network. On the other hand, if we have more granular price signals reflecting the actual system conditions, we can also help decide where investments are needed in generation assets. Let's take an example here as well. If the prices are consistently high in an area, again, let's say where there's close to a city or there's an industrial production site, renewable energy developers can identify a business case and invest, let's say, in micro wind turbines or solar power plants. And we can unpack some of the things later in the discussion, but I would like to stop here in the interest of time. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that this has replied to your question. We cannot hear you.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Elena. The next question goes to Carolina. Carolina, what do we need in legal terms to implement a digital power purchase agreement? It is possible? Carolina, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning to all who are watching and listening to this session, and special greeting and thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to participate in this Energy Innovation Week, and in particular in this first session. I apologize in advance for my English. It's not my first language and I don't get to practice it very often, so bear with me. Well, I think this is a very relevant moment to think and discuss together in times of uncertainty the various regulatory challenges that we will face in order to have a flexible electricity system that is capable of facing the problems of ensuring efficient operation and expansion of electricity system under the new paradigms of electricity generation, such as the high penetration of variable renewable energy, decarbonization, digitalization, increased distributed generation, or decentralization. New technologies present us with new paradigms, and in the future, they will change the current energy system. Therefore, we have to analyze, discuss, research, and obtain information that will shed light on the opportunities we will have to consume electricity in a decentralized manner with quality, economically and social profitable. In order to implement a PPA from a legal standpoint, we need to have a smart regulation framework. That is, the digitalization process itself must be accompanied by an efficient regulatory development by the corresponding entities to ensure that the process is done in an agile, objective, and non-discriminatory manner. In most cases, technological advances are developed and this in speed that outruns by far the speed of regulations development, making it necessary to move towards a process of smart regulation, where the goal is not to regulate more, but to do so more efficiently, maintaining an attractive and flexible economic environment for the private sector activity. The advance of the digitalization process and the transformation for the energy sector will require new regulatory principles that guarantee the following: to simplify the bureaucratic process between companies and the regulator entity, to provide a flexible legal framework, but with clear rules for all actors, to harmonize the rights of consumer, users, regulators, and businesses, and to bring added value to the sector being regulated. And then, what are the approaches that should be taken by the regulations on digitalization? First of all, we must ask ourselves, what is that we want? Where do we want to go? In doing so, we should keep a more flexible regulatory scheme in mind. Now, it is sensible to think that if there are technological advances that bring benefits to the system, there can be no regulation or legislation that says it is not allowed. We shouldn't say in this changing context with rapid technological advances that the implementation of a new initiative, it is not allowed because the legislation says so. This is obviously considering that once the technical economical concepts are clear, they can be translated into relevant regulatory provisions when necessary. So the question is more clarity or regulatory certainty in a changing context. Are regulatory certainty and regulatory flexibility at odds with each other or in order to cope with technological changes? Or are they somehow complementary concepts? In my opinion, have rules that adapt to technological changes, for example, regulatory flexibility, also brings certainty to the system, encourage investments and boosts countries' development. In the first place, we should start with what we have at hand. That is, we should deepen the articulation of competencies and roles in the administration and truly exercise the functions that already exist in the institutional framework of the electricity sector. This should be agile and efficient, consistent and coherent among them. Regulation should seek to anticipate technological changes so as not to be an entry barrier to the integration of new technologies when they have already proven their application. Or, at the very least, regulation should accompany technological advances but not lag behind them. There is legislation in certain countries on electrical matters that has already incorporated R&D into the sector's institutional framework, but this framework should enhance the urgency and strength in which it should be implemented. We see in the facts that sometimes it is not necessary to have a law to integrate technology into the normative or regulatory framework of each country. And the question then arises as to whether the technology issue is a market issue, a public issue, or a research issue. I leave the question posed. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. The third question is for Hadley. Hadley, what are the kinds of digital contracts that we need to develop infrastructure to balance access and affordability in low and middle income countries? Hadley, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thanks to also the panelists and all the participants joining us today. Just as by a quick means of introductions, I'm happy to represent Sustainable Energy for All today. We're an international organization. We work with leaders in government and private sector and civil society to drive further, faster action towards Sustainable Development Goal 7. And this is really the guiding force behind all of our work, focused on achieving universal access to sustainable energy by 2030. And I think probably many of us on this call know that we as a global community, we're unfortunately far off track from meeting this goal, with 789 million still without access to electricity globally, and even more, 2.8 billion without access to clean cooking fuels. But I'm happy to participate in this panel today because particularly in the energy access space, we're seeing that digitalization and digital technologies are allowing us to reach these people who are often in rural and remote regions that do not have access to modern electricity or modern cooking fuels. To reach these people with new technologies and new business models driven by digital solutions, which in many cases are the least cost solution and way to reach these people versus the traditional grid-centric approach. And if I can speak particularly to the electricity access space, I think most of us know, about the kind of success story of mobile money being coupled with solar home systems and being distributed on a pay-as-you-go model to rural and remote customers, which has really essentially been what has unlocked the business model for solar home system distributor companies to be able to interact with their customers, which again are often very rural and remote and hard to reach places, and collect their tariffs on a monthly basis and maintain that customer relationship through mobile applications. We're seeing the same is true for mini grids as well. Often the digital technology allows headquarters to be alerted, which is often in the capital city or maybe even on a different continent altogether, to troubleshoot the system with the engineers in headquarters and liaise with those on the ground to bring the system back up and running. And I also want to mention that, beyond these applications, we're also seeing increasing innovation in this digitalization and energy access space. For example, when it comes to geospatial mapping and least cost electrification analyses, these are really changing the way that a lot of these low access countries are planning their energy systems of the future. This is reliant on data, often data that is not always there. Not all countries have the benefit of knowing where all the people who need electricity or access to clean cooking are and what their energy needs are. So we're seeing machine learning coming into this space, combining satellite imagery and geospatial analyses to fill some of these data gaps. We're also now seeing as well in some countries that have a large proliferation of decentralized systems, such as Bangladesh with solar home systems. We see a company there that is starting to interconnect these solar home systems to create ground up, bottom up mini grids, essentially, offering peer-to-peer energy trading in rural and remote communities in Bangladesh. And then I also even want to mention, from the utility side as well, in Gambia, we see the utility is offering the Gambian diaspora living abroad the opportunity to pay their family members utility electricity bills back home just via their mobile or the website. So these are really interesting applications that are addressing both the rural and remote nature of this population of those without energy access, but also the affordability barriers, which really can't be, understated when we're talking about these people. And so what I'm hoping to get through in the discussion today is that it really is up to the policymakers and the regulatory framework to allow for these innovative business models, and also to keep encouraging this data that is being generated through these private sector companies to feed that back up to the government, because this is really essential for least cost electrification planning, which is so important in these countries. And lastly, I really like the way that Elena put it at the beginning, getting financiers to understand the value of this data. These are customers that often don't have formal banking relationships, and so a lot of financiers may see them as a risky customer base for a company. But what we really need to do is is have the financiers understand the potential of this market, the size of this market, as I mentioned, almost 1 billion people around the world, and understand the data and the value in this data, and to offer competitive and affordable financing, which will ultimately address the affordability issue with the end user. And so just to close it off, I think it goes without saying, you know, there's no better time for governments to really start addressing their policy and regulatory frameworks and ensuring that mini grid companies and solar home system companies and even clean cook stove providers can operate in this space, they can innovate in this space with digital technologies, and that we can recover better out of this COVID crisis that's facing us today, and that you know, energy access can really be at the heart of this green transition. And so I'm looking forward to the discussion and happy to speak to this more. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Hadley. Please, Miguel. Please, Miguel.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was trying to find the unmute button. Very nice. I think it was even nicer than I expected, the intervention from the CRU, because they were naturally very connected, the three of them, and this second block very quickly, and it was it's in our mind, it's the beginning of the discussion this week would be exactly the point everyone is making here, that we need to change regulation in order to realize value. And my answer always is, okay, let's do that. What do I need to do first? And it's very difficult because you need to go from very big banks to even household in Bangladesh, as Hadley said, or small businesses coming out from MBAs, or big companies trying to pivot from offshore oil to offshore wind. And I think what Carolina said was very insightful for me, which is, okay, how do we combine all of these so that we have regulatory stability and at the same time we have regulatory flexibility, which is essentially a paradox in a way that we need to resolve. So my question here for the three of you, because I'm lazier than Danielle, so I do the same question for the three of you, is what kind of experiments can we do to decide essentially what goes first, what can wait, what is super urgent, what is, let's say, postponable. I think we can keep the order, or we begin with Elena and then Carolina and then Hadley.
Yes, thank you very much. Indeed, I really like the way you have put this together. Now it's how do we do this? But I would like to provoke another and reply with another question, and that is, what is the problem? What are we trying to solve? So I don't need to paraphrase or quote very famous people here, but the question is always, what is the issue? Let's spend more time on the problem before we spend time on the solution. And we heard from Hadley actually that energy access is a problem. And another one refers to meeting the Paris Agreement. So there is an international agreement on climate. And we know that in order to achieve it, we need to scale up the renewable share in the electricity generation from about 26% today to 86% by 2050. So this means a significant scale up of renewables. And today the costs of these technologies have decreased dramatically. So in fact, solar and wind, we can consider them to be mature technologies today in many parts of the world, and cost competitive, and they have achieved grid parity. But I think this is already clear that technology alone is not enough. We have heard this. I tried to illustrate this using the 4 dimensions that we're using in our innovation landscape report. And just as brackets, I would like to draw the attention of our audience today to Irina's work in this sense. We have published and we have actually worked over the past few years, and we have recently completed this project, which is called Innovations for Renewable Powered Future. And there we have mapped the various innovations that can help achieve this global aim. And among those innovations, we of course talk also about blockchain, artificial intelligence, and IoT. So what I'm trying to say with this is that indeed technology is not enough. We need also to have new business models. And I think Hadley also mentioned a couple of them. And Carolina also touched upon another element. We need to have regulations in place that allow for the private sector to capitalize on all these enabling technologies, to value all this data. And here I would like to perhaps just mention a couple of these innovations to see what we can do and what we, let's say, should leave for later. And I think trials, learning by doing, allowing to a certain extent the private sector to fail. And when I say fail, I don't mean keep us in blackouts. This is not possible in the sector we are working on. But there are regulatory sandboxes, and there are prominent examples all over the world emerging. We've seen this also in the UK, in the Nordics. So this can be allowed, this trial, these safe spaces for the private sector to test, to see the results, to have an impact at a lower scale, and eventually scale this up later. This is possible. So I mentioned the market design innovations. I mentioned the time and the space granularities. But also in system operation, there are innovations that we can try out. And I know examples also in Uruguay, for example, where dynamic line ratings are being used, also enabled by digital technologies. The business models among those also mentioned by Hadley were pay-as-you-go models, but there are also energy as a service, peer-to-peer trading, energy communities, aggregators. So there are many things in there. But at the end of the day, and this is one of the messages I would like you to also perhaps take home, is that innovations do not emerge in isolation. And we need to combine innovations across the various dimensions, also at institutional level, as Carolina has very well highlighted, so that we can actually offer a practical solution. And this can be from Bangladesh to India, to Morocco, to Uruguay, to Sweden, different. So if we do not tailor these solutions to the actual problem that each of the system is facing, I think we won't go too far. So there's not a simple manual of how we can actually make this happen. We need to tailor to the specific system needs. Thank you very much.
Maybe I can pick up on that, and I'm probably going to echo actually a lot of what Elena has mentioned. And I think, I mean, if we come back to the core, you know, also talking about what the problem is. I mean, energy has always been in developed countries, developing, it's a very political issue, right? And political cycles, as we know, are much shorter than long-term investments, especially in large-scale energy infrastructure. But I think if we look at why is energy political, and what are the things that are the tension points, let's say, no matter what country you're in, it's issues of reliability, it's issue of the tariff, and then increasingly, as the world is becoming more aware of the climate crisis, it's the issue of environmental sustainability. And of course, these three things are inextricably intertwined as well in terms of the operation of an energy system. And if, from my perspective, when, you know, the question you asked, Miguel, is like, you know, talking about which digital applications, where do we focus digitalization in this kind of energy planning, down to regulation, down to implementation practice, I think the area where we have to prioritize, given that the private sector that is kind of on the ground is using digital applications to make those business models work. From my perspective, let's say the most upstream component is the one that is the highest priority, which is in energy planning. Because this is what touches on the sustainability, the reliability, and at the end of the day, the affordability through the tariffs. And as I mentioned, more and more countries, especially those that are dealing with large access gaps, are starting to take integrated approaches to planning their future energy system. And this is really reliant on having data. And that is, in many of these countries, one of the biggest issues. But if you were to have, a very robust and complete data, and you were to do a least cost electrification analysis, identifying where's the most appropriate technology, also based on your renewable assets, what your energy system of the future looks like. From that point, you can then have more regulatory stability, because there is a clear plan in place for what share do we want of solar versus wind on this system, how many people or villages do we expect to be best served by mini grids, where will the solar home systems be. Once the government has a clear understanding and of an electrification plan that is driven by this geospatial data and least cost planning, from then, I think we will see a lot more efficient and digital applications in regulation emerge. There will be, I think, a lot more foresight on the different regulations and the different open tenders or windows for private sector. And I think this, for me, it's perhaps, maybe it's taking the easy answer to the question, but the priority needs to be the most upstream in the planning. And then we can see kind of digital applications address further down the process and value chain.
But then let me rephrase my question for Carolina, just benefiting from Heile's comment. If a lawyer receives a very detailed energy planning for the next 50 years, what they need to do to implement that? Is there a need for experimentation with a very detailed energy planning, Carolina?
As I said, regulation should seek to anticipate technological changes, so as not to be an entry barrier to the integration of new technologies. However, there are alternatives to adapt the regulation to the technological innovations that may arise. For example, for pilot experience in which entry barriers are raised for projects with new technologies or allowing unregulated developments. Also, providing technical advice and accompaniment to those projects for a certain period of time, not standing due supervision, evaluation, and audit of experiences over. Once the innovation has been tested and evaluated, it is feasible to promote regulatory adjustment and, if necessary, to develop this market.
Okay. Yep.
In Chile, we have an example. One of the latest reforms to the General Electricity Service Law that created the National Electrical Coordinator of the system mandated this entity with the functions associated with research, development, and innovation in order to improve the operation and coordination of the electricity system through a critical and permanent analysis of the performance of the electricity system and market, the promotion for the incorporation of new technologies, and the exchange of experience with other organizations seeking the incorporation of wide spectrum of agents linked to R&D national and international, and providing the coordinator with a permanent budget associated with these functions. And in 2018, a pilot project was carried out by the coordinator together with the companies, First Solar and Engie. This marks the first stone of the work that the coordinator intends to carry out in research, development, and innovation, of contributing to safety and efficiency in the coordination of the electricity system and market. In this context, the coordinator promoted and made possible the innovation and development of ancillary service in a generation plant with variable renewable energy sources, which will positively affect the way in which companies operating in flexible wholesale markets will be regulated.
Okay, Carolina, I'm sorry, we're running a bit late. If you can wrap up the example, it would be really nice. Sorry. I mean, you can conclude.
Well, what I want to show with this example is that although R&D was given by legal mandate to the coordinator with the possibility of an associated budget, 2 years after its creation, the sectorial authority of duty pointed out that the coordinator should prioritize on its agenda other matters inherent to its institutional functions. To date, an optimal development in technology advance has not been achieved along with the transformation of the energy sector that we are experiencing. The institutional framework of R&D in the National Electric Coordination is pending issue, which has not allowed this important attribution to be consolidated and promoted in its operation.
Okay, thanks for that. Thanks for that. Very nice. I think, Jess, very quickly to have some room for Q&A. If you can show the poll now, I don't know if you hear, if you're listening. Yes, this is a very open question. That is the kind of thing I like to do, which is essentially very confusing to everyone. Let me explain a bit what I'm trying to do here. We're concerned with with digitalization of the system and what's the role digitalization serves. We're talking about very different things here. On the one hand, big investments, even in the comments, things like that have appeared already. We will comment in a bit. They're very big things, more traditional ones, involving possibly large investments related to energy planning. And also we're having very decentralized things. Even the word democratization has already appeared. My question is that a smart contract, which is in a way the transactional form of this digitalization world, is going to allow to have easier transactions, is going to be against easier transactions, or depends on the kind of asset involved. What do you think? Now, I think we need to vote quickly and move on.
It looks like all of the votes for the most part are in, so I will
Good.
Can you see the results, Miguel, here?
I can't. No, sorry.
42%, 43% saying yes, just 2% saying no, and they're shifting a little bit, but here we go. 51% saying depends on the kind of asset involved. So we almost have a tie between the yes and depends on the asset involved.
I have this a lot, which is usually the answer depends is related to, I don't know what the strange Spanish guy is thinking. So probably what I want to highlight here, and for me it's surprising. There's very little impressions that smart contracting can be harmful in some situations. So if we can move to the slide to try to explain a bit the kind of trade-off I'm seeing here. I'm not sure if it's controlled by me, Jess.
I will share.
No, okay.
Just 1 second. Okay.
Well, more or less the idea of what I'm trying to do is that the kind of transactional advantage that you can have with a smart contract, which is related to automation of transactions, are very related to the speed that you can share data and use data and decide on data. And this was very clearly expressed by Hadley and Elena. And to some point by Carolina, no? And that's true. The idea is that we have opportunities that we did not have in the past, related essentially to the fact that it's easier to deal with a lot of data. The limited rationality of human beings to deal with very granular contracts is in a way, let's say, alleviated or facilitated. But the question is that a smart contract is somehow not so favorable. It's not so facilitating of the establishment of a continued bilateral relationship. If you need a long-term contract, if you need to have a 20-year long relationship with a client where your incentives are not aligned, which is basically associated with big investments, infrastructure, smart contracts can be really increasing the difficulty of this transaction, because renegotiation can be more difficult, or we need to be careful with the kind of renegotiation mechanism we put in place. So how can we look at this? Because we have a good thing and a bad thing, probably going along the lines of the vote of depends on the kind of asset. We have advantages essentially related to data, granular contracts, and so on. And this is typically associated, or the advantages of that are associated with situations where conflict is less relevant than data sharing. I'm thinking, for example, in logistics within firms, where you have already a governance structure in place, and what you're trying to do is to improve data sharing, data automation, etc. Smart neighborhood, situations where incentives are more or less aligned. When you have situations where data is not that important, at least relatively, or when compared to resolution of conflicts, of adaptation in the long term, decentralization tends to be more expensive. So in that sense, everything that involves let's say infrastructure projects, big things that cannot be deployed elsewhere. So you depend a lot on the identity, or you depend a lot on your partner in the business. Smart contracts can be not so useful. So in this sense, the conclusion I want to put forward today, which is in a way also an introduction for the rest of the week, is that it's very difficult to decide in which point for each assets we are. Of course, there are extreme points, but normally, especially in these times of uncertainty, we will be at some middle point, some halfway between the two. And answering, in a way, the kind of experimentation we need. And I think, putting a framework and agreeing with our panelists, the kind of experimentation we need goes along the lines of deciding whether we are in a conflict situation, let's say whether we need a long-term contract with a relevant role for not automated things, or we can rely more on automation and let's say let the artificial intelligence do their thing. And one of the drivers we need to understand that, and this is something that we're going to discuss a lot in the next days, is how can we define this in terms of bankability of contracts? Our concern here is defining value, not in terms of the investor, the energy investor, but in terms of the financial investor. How can we create contractual solutions that are okay for financiers, and what's the role of public policy? I think that would be it for conclusions today. We had a couple of questions I want to share with the speakers. Let me see the chat. And I think there's Tisura here asking a very interesting question that goes along with what we're saying, which is, and this is for any of you who want to answer, which is my favorite question. We're always talking about trials or pilots and so on, but how can we scale up those trials? What's the process to transform successful small experiences in project finance, essentially? So I mean, Hadley can help here with an African experience. What do you think?
Thanks, Mika. I'm just looking through the questions. Which one specifically are you referring to? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm looking for it too. Sorry, I saw it before. It's from Tisura. How do we mainstream trials or pilot projects into contracts or project finance in developing countries?
Okay, I don't see that one on my.
Actually, that one is in the chat, not in.
It's in the chat, not in the Q&A.
Sorry, I'm.
Yeah.
I'm looking at two different windows.
No, don't worry, don't worry. But you hear the question, or you can read it.
Okay, now I'm searching for it again. Okay, how do we mainstream trials for projects into contracts or project finance in developing countries? I see. I mean, of course, a regulatory framework or environment needs to first, of course, be open enough to allow these trials. I think what we're seeing a lot, let me make the example of in the mini grid space, is often governments will first open up a window and offer concessionary agreements to mini grid developers, get experience under their belts. Often when it comes to mini grid regulation, this has a lot to do with understanding the tariff calculation model, as well as the what happens when the grid arrives conditions. And in negotiating those concessionary agreements, often learn a lot from this process, which is then translated in the future to an open regulation with those learnings being stipulated in the open regulation. So I think this is perhaps a good example of how starting with a few government to private sector contracts because this is ultimately a new space for many people. When it comes to solar home systems and mini grids, let's all acknowledge that the more developed countries, that was not the pathway to an energy system. So this is new, this is innovative, this is using new technologies which are sustainable, which is fantastic. But it's also asking these governments, which are often resource constrained to begin with, to lead the way on new regulatory mechanisms and measures, and also deal with a lot of new stakeholders which hadn't been as involved in building an energy system in the past. And so I think this has been a way that we have seen some countries, particularly in the mini grid space, go from working with just a few private sector stakeholders, understanding the framework that they feel comfortable with, and then moving that more into an open regulation model.
Thank you, Harley. We have here another question. I think it is for Elena. Elena, what pricing model is best for affordable renewable energy for rural areas in developing countries?
Thank you very much. I think that's a very tough question. So thank you for asking this one. So what we have been doing is actually looking at the innovations that are out there and can help tackle some of the challenges we mentioned today, right? We talked about access, we talked about increasing the share of renewables, replacing obsolete and polluting technologies with cleaner ones, more modern ones. But we have not necessarily looked at the pricing things in themselves. However, one element which is interesting, perhaps, if you look at the pricing and the tariffs, that comes back to the question that I was posing before. What is the problem? And if the problem is in a developing country that the country lacks access, then we need to make sure that the people, the citizens in that country, have access to electricity and energy in the first place. And then we turn upside down the questions, and then you can ask, okay, what are the solutions? What are the options that are there? And I think Hadley made a very strong case today for solar home systems, renewable mini grids, pay-as-you-go models, enabled by mobile payment. All of these things are innovations that in developed countries, they have not taken off yet, right? So again, the question is, what is the problem? Then we can see how we can finance that. So if I would tell you that, we need to increase the share of solar energy in a developed country, we need to have flexible dynamic tariffs like time of use tariffs, they wouldn't really reply to the question. But if the question of providing clean cooking technologies to African communities, well, then we have to understand what the real challenges are that these communities are facing. And then perhaps the answer is, depending on the context, of course, maybe the answer is they're lacking access to capital markets. They're lacking access to financial institutions, but they do have mobile payments. They do have a mobile connection in the first place, which can enable mobile payments, and then we can innovate from there. And I think this was really a success story. So again, the question is not so simple and not so straightforward to answer, but I would always like to ask, what is the challenge we're trying to address? And based on that, we can tailor the solutions based on the really vast innovations that we see out there. And this is from smart contracts to artificial intelligence to trials in the regulatory world and so on and so forth. So I hope this allows me to bring at least a couple of elements into this puzzle. Thank you. I think we cannot hear you.
Okay, sorry, here.
Thank you.
We have a question to Carolina. In developing countries, it is asked by Jofilin Beyumula. In developing countries where digitalization is still at infant stage, aligning technological advancement together with regulatory framework would pose complex scenario to be resolved. What are the best approach to undertake under these scenarios based on your experience?
Thank you, Daniel. Well, I think each country has its own reality, but I think there must be a public policy, as Hartley has said, has already mentioned, political decision to gradually change the regulatory framework and also gradually promote the sense of pilot projects in the private sector. And also there are funding available, provide, but by international organization that developing countries can have access to. In short answer.
Thank you.
I think we need to close now. Our time is over. Thank you very much, the speakers. I hope you can join.
Thank you.
For the rest
Thank
of
you.
the week. We will probably we'll be discussing a lot of the questions you put forward today from other points of view. So please join. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you, the panelists and all the audience.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And remember to join us live on Twitter after the week is over, after we conduct all of the sessions. Any of your questions that we missed during this session, you can submit at FSR_energy on Twitter using the hashtag AskFSR. And on our live session on Twitter on Friday, we will keep all of the session discussions going. Have a wonderful afternoon and evening.
See you tomorrow and the Thursdays too.